Most people know that Napoleon invaded Russia and that it was a disaster. What most people don't know is why Napoleon invaded Russia in the first place. That's what we're going to explore in this video. And what we're going to find is that Napoleon's decision to invade Russia was not irrational. In fact, for Napoleon to fulfill his vision, he needed to confront Russia in 1812. I'm not going to argue that Napoleon's vision was a good one. I am not an imperialist, but Napoleon did have a vision for France and for Europe, and Russia was standing in his way. To understand why, let's look at this map. This is a map of Europe before the French Revolution. The key thing to see here is that there are 5 great powers. You have France, which has the largest population and the strongest army. You have the United Kingdom, which has the strongest navy and the strongest economy. Prussia and Austria are the 2 great German states. And then there's Russia, which is far off in the east. It is an up-and-coming empire at this point. Now let's look at this map of 1812. France is much larger. He has firm control over Germany and Italy. Prussia and Austria have been militarily defeated and are reluctant allies of France. The only 2 great powers who are not under Napoleon's thumb are the United Kingdom and Russia. On the surface, it may look like Napoleon is in a commanding position, but what I want you to know is that Napoleon's dominant position was actually more fragile than it appeared. The United Kingdom has been fighting France pretty much nonstop since 1792. They don't have the army to be able to take down France by themselves, but their navy is very strong. And by this point, the French navy, well, it's under the sea. So there's nothing that Napoleon can do to knock Britain out of the war. Britain is also finding ways to hurt Napoleon. In 1812, the big way it's doing that is by fighting Napoleon in Spain. See, in 1808, Napoleon made probably his biggest mistake of his career. He betrayed his ally Spain and tried to install his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. The Spanish people, understandably, were not crazy about some French guy being their king, so they rose and revolt against the French. Spain is much weaker than France at this point. However, Spain is a large country, so the French needed to dedicate a tremendous amount of manpower and resources to combat this revolt. The British were actively supporting the Spanish, and while the French were not losing the war, they also were not winning the war. And the reason they weren't able to win the war was because of what was going on in Russia. For a brief period after 1807, when Russia and France made peace, Russia was an ally of France. But by 1810, that was no longer the case. The Russian Tsar Alexander had 2 big problems with Napoleon. The first issue was that the Russian Tsar was actually intermarried with a lot of German royal families. And as you can tell by the map, Napoleon had gobbled up a lot of territory in Germany, which meant a lot of German princes had lost their crowns. But more importantly, Russia had a problem with a state that Napoleon had created called the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. See, one of the biggest differences between that first map I showed you and the second map I showed you is Poland. In the first map, Poland is quite large. In the second map, Poland is gone. The reason why Poland was gone was because Austria, Russia, and Prussia had destroyed it and gobbled up all of its land. After Napoleon decisively defeated Prussia in 1807, they decided to take the Polish territories that Prussia controlled and create the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Now, this was not a Polish state. It was still ruled by some German guy. However, to outsiders, especially the Russians, it looked like a precursor to a Polish state. That was a huge problem for the Russian Tsar because he was ruling a bunch of Poles and he did not want them rallying around a new Polish state. It was clear that Russia was not happy with the status quo in Europe, and Napoleon feared, probably correctly, that when the opportunity arose, Russia would probably try to destroy the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, turn Austria and Prussia against France, and thus trigger the biggest war that Napoleon would have faced. This is where Spain comes in. Spain is on the other side of Europe from Russia, but this is a time before railroads, before telegraphs. You can't just move people around quickly. So Napoleon could not commit his full forces to Spain because he had to leave enough troops in the east in order to deter a Russian attack. There was another piece that pushed Napoleon to invade Russia, and that was the fact that Russia was allowing British goods into its ports. Napoleon had created something called the Continental System. The idea was that European countries could not trade with the United Kingdom. This system had 2 goals. The first was to weaken Britain by preventing it from trading with its neighbors. The second reason, and probably the most important reason, was to strengthen the French economy. See, Napoleon was an old-school mercantilist. He believed that the prosperity of France depended on it exporting more than it imported. British goods were cheaper and of higher quality than French goods. So by excluding British goods, European states would have no choice but to buy from the French. Russia was officially not allowing British goods into its ports, but it had in essence created a giant loophole that allowed British goods to indirectly enter European markets. So Napoleon was in a strategic stalemate. He was unable to end the war in Spain, he was unable to bring about peace with the United Kingdom, and the French economy was under threat, all because of what was going on in Russia. Napoleon believed that if he could defeat the Russian army, he could force a new peace treaty on the Russians that would close their ports to British goods. He could then turn his attention fully to Spain, finish the job there. At that point, the United Kingdom would have no reason to continue the war. This, Napoleon believed, was the only path that he had to lasting peace and prosperity for his empire. For years, I thought, okay, let's take Napoleon at his word. Let's say he believes everything that I just laid out here. Why not just let the Russians attack you first? That way you have the moral high ground and you don't have to invade Russia. The answer to that is that that's not how Napoleon rolled. Okay, Napoleon's success was in large part because he would attack his enemies before they could get organized. Napoleon would always fight the battles on his terms. That is how he won his brilliant Italian campaign against Austria. That is how he won his greatest victories at Austerlitz. That is how he brought Prussia to the brink of extinction at the Battle of Jena. Napoleon lived and died by taking the initiative, and more often than not, it worked out for him. Plus, honestly, there's a reality that if Russia did attack, they might have been able to flip Austria and Prussia, which would have created an enormous problem for Napoleon. So we're almost at Napoleon's invasion of Russia, but there are two more things that I want to talk about here. The first was what Napoleon's plan was. Napoleon did not intend to go very far into Russia. His plan was to fight the Russian army near the border, defeat it, and then occupy the territory of the former state of Poland. At that point, he would offer to negotiate. If the Tsar agreed to close his ports to British goods and give him some security guarantees, then mission accomplished. Napoleon could go home and go fight in Spain. If the Tsar was not eager to negotiate, then Napoleon would declare a new Polish state, which would be larger and, relatively strong. And that new Polish state could hold Napoleon's eastern flank with some limited French support, while Napoleon turned his attention back west. And to be honest, that was not a terrible plan. That is a plan that could have worked. The second thing I want to bring up is that Napoleon did not want to fight this war on his own. Russia had recently taken territory from two of its neighbors, Sweden in the north and the Ottoman Empire in the south. Napoleon figured that they would want that land back and would join with him in fighting the Russians. If that had happened, then the Russians would be fighting on multiple fronts and would have a very difficult time withstanding Napoleon's assault. Napoleon really screwed this up because in order to enforce his continental blockade, he seized some Swedish territory that had been opening their ports to British goods. This infuriated the Swedes, and they actually went into the Russian camp. As for the Ottomans, the Russians played their hand really well. They offered back some of the territory that they had seized from the Ottomans. The Ottomans figured, hey, if we can get this territory back without having to fight for it, we're going to take that deal. Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812 with the largest army that had yet been assembled in human history. This army was so large that it was kind of a disaster. It was very difficult to supply, it was very difficult to maneuver, but more importantly, the Russians had no interest in fighting it. Napoleon tried to provoke this decisive battle that he wanted, but the Russians would not oblige. They kept retreating, and Napoleon would pursue, and the Russians would keep retreating, and Napoleon would pursue. Before he knew it, Napoleon was well beyond the lines that he had initially intended to cross. It wasn't until the Grand Armée was at the gates of Moscow that the Russians stood and fought. Napoleon won that battle, but it was not a decisive victory. It is now autumn. Napoleon's depleted army is in Moscow. It's impossible to supply. Napoleon realizes that he needs to retreat. It is during that retreat when disease, hunger, Russian attacks, and that famous General Winter destroyed Napoleon's army. Over 500,000 men entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 left it. A year later, Napoleon's empire was gone. I hope you enjoyed this video exploring Napoleon's motivations for invading Russia. If you did, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.